Cool. All right, I'm gonna start admitting everybody and then we will get started.
Great. Maura, do you want to kick off?
I was just going to ask you. I'll do it. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I can
great.
start.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We're going to start in about a minute as people roll in. Okay. Yeah, normally the first 5 minutes of our webinars are people entering the Zoom room. So that's the nice thing about a lunch hour. All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Joanna Veronkovich. I am the co-faculty director of the Center for Cultural Affairs, and this is our last installment of the workshop series in Cultural Affairs for a little while until we restart again in February. So it's been a really wonderful past few months with some awesome speakers, great conversation. And I think today we're going to continue on that trend with a really exciting presentation from our friends, Maura Cuffie Peterson and Jamie Hand over at Creatives Rebuild New York. And Maura and Jamie are going to be talking about the programs that CRNY has launched and been running for the last, what is it, 2 or 3 years that CRNY, is it 3 years? 3 years that CRNY has been working on and is now kind of coming to an end. And they'll talk a little bit more about that. But so excited to hear about this work. And obviously, we have an interest in it here at the Center for Cultural Affairs, and that we've been working closely with Maura and Jamie on the evaluation of the guaranteed income program they'll be talking about today. So with that, I will hand it over to Maura to do a proper introduction, and then to start up, we'll usually do the same thing, take our questions after Maura and Jamie complete their presentation, but also you can feel free to be chatting along in the chat, and I'll be picking those up along the way. All right, Maura, I'll give it over to you.
Amazing. Thanks, Joanna, for the intro. And thank you again for inviting Jamie and I to share some of what we've experienced and learned along our journey at Creatives Rebuild New York. As Joanna mentioned, we're super proud to be partnering with Joanna and Doug and the IU team on a really robust and important impact evaluation, which we'll talk a little bit about. But make sure you reach out to those two for more of the details, as that will be hot off the press later on this month, I should say. I'm going to share my screen and we'll kick it off that way. So again, Maura Cuffie Peterson here. I oversee all things guaranteed income at Creatives Rebuild New York. Jamie, do you want to do a little title moment too while we're here? Might as well.
Sure. Thanks, Maura. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Joanna and Doug, for having us, and Becca for hosting us. As Maura said, I'm Jamie Hand. I'm her colleague at Creatives Rebuild. I oversee our impact and narrative change work. So that's our research and policy and communications efforts. Back to you.
Awesome. So just a quick overview for everybody here. Creatives Rebuild New York was a 3-year, $125 million statewide initiative funded by private philanthropy, specifically the Mellon, Ford, and Stavros Niarchos foundations. We are at the end point of that 3 years. So you can imagine this December is packed like with all of tying up the loose ends, ensuring that the stories are out there and that people can access the learning and take on the work in their own way into the future. The work that we've done really centers on a few things, particularly a guaranteed income program for artists, which we'll talk more in depth about today. Although I want to also point out a really incredible artist employment program that served over 300 artists in collaboration with over 100 community-based organizations. Again, noting here that New York for us is New York State. So we're working at the scale of a state, not just the city. All of our programmatic work has been designed by artists for artists. So if you're a program design nerd like Jamie and I are, and you want to get into the nuts and bolts of what participatory and co-design looks like, we have some other reports and models you can consider around how we got to where we are. And then finally, a lot of the work that Jamie oversees, how do we ensure that these programs have lasting lasting impact, right, beyond the immediate cash relief through impact narrative change and policy and advocacy work. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about the guaranteed income program. So if you'll allow me. I hope folks are starting to get more and more familiar with what guaranteed income even is to begin with. I know when I first took on this job, I had been seeing little bits here and there about universal basic income, basic income. There were all of these pilots starting around guaranteed income. And it's been a real pleasure to get more deeply involved with the larger movement of people trying to change the narrative around who deserves to be made whole, who deserves to have an income floor, who deserves economic security. So I just wanted to begin there to say guaranteed income is really an economic intervention that provides no strings attached payments consistently over a period of time to people, individuals, right? And the idea is that people are trustworthy and know how to address their own needs on their own terms. We're not telling you you have to spend this money on this, that, or third. You know what you need in order to take care of yourselves. It's can be quite a freeing and different way of thinking about how we move money to people, particularly in a philanthropic or social service agency sort of mindset. The basics about our guaranteed income program for artists are that we serve 2,400 artists, again, all across New York State. I think we covered 61 of 62 counties in New York State with monthly no strings attached cash payments for 18 months. No strings attached really means no strings attached here. So not come tell us the write report, make this project, spend it only on your art form, really whatever it is you need to sustain your livelihood. Other important notes about our program are that we strategically designed this. Again, I briefly mentioned the think tank earlier, but the think tank really, again, a group of just over 20 people who are artists, who are experts in the guaranteed income field, whether policy experts, research experts, et cetera, and more who fall into those various categories to, figure out how to make this meaningful and how to align it with the overall movement. Again, I mentioned we're not the only ones working on guaranteed income, lots of people are, and it was really important to us that we developed and implemented a program considering how big of a scale our program was compared to other pilots at the time that would support the movement and not hurt it. So for us, our eligibility was quite simple. You needed to be a resident of New York State at the time of application, have financial need as determined by the self-sufficiency standard. Sounds simple, a little complex. Talk to me about it in the chat. I have lots of thoughts and feelings. Then of course, be an artist, which I imagine for this group knows how complicated that might be to delineate, define, and make sense of in an eligibility criteria. Other keynotes here are that differ guaranteed income from other sort of money moving or grant making type programs are that the selection was randomized. You could call it a lottery in a colloquial kind of way. We had to use weighted randomized selection as the official terminology and legal terminology that we had to adopt, and is also true for how the selection happened, meaning it wasn't based on how excellent you may or may not have been as an artist, how much merit or how much deservingness some subjective body like myself or our organization deemed upon you. It was not about that at all. It was really, are you eligible, right? Do you meet these criteria? And then the randomized selection took place. We were grateful again with the guidance of our think tank to make that selection such that people who face structural barriers to financial security could be prioritized in the selection. What does that really mean? That means we had over 22,000 people apply to our program, and we knew it would be really important to showcase all the things we know to be true anecdotally in our own experiences as artists ourselves, as cultural workers, et cetera, that artists are facing precarity, that artists hold all of these identities and live and work within community, are belonging in communities that face these structural barriers, meaning that artists are Black, Indigenous, people of color, artists are queer, artists are caregivers, are immigrants, are involved in the legal system, right? Are living in rural parts of the state as well. So those are just to give you a little flavor, you know, of who we mean when we say prioritizing. We know that artists hold these identities again. We were excited to be able to prioritize them in our selection. Wanted to share a couple more notes about who are artists. I mentioned who these 2,400 artists are. The next couple of slides just share some graphics around who, how people identified themselves in the initial application. This will be, I hope, useful reference point as Jamie shares a little bit more about some of the findings that Joanna Doug and the other team of researchers are coming to find in their work. You can see here that the financial stability of artists is under question, that perhaps there isn't as much financial stability as a larger, and I might even venture to say, toxic narrative that exists around artists being of a certain class status, right? This, of course, aligns pretty closely with the eligibility I mentioned around the self-sufficiency standard, having financial need. But I'd just like to point out that it was important both for us to ensure that we were supporting artists who have financial need, but also because the larger guaranteed income movement, we hoped would see artists as deserving as any other population that might be focused on in a guaranteed income pilot. And using the self-sufficiency standard allowed us to do that. And of course, the results are unfortunate. There's no pride in me sharing that 62% of artists, right, in that application pool said they have no financial safety net, that 40% are vulnerable to a medical emergency. These are numbers we shouldn't be okay with. And we hope that moving that as the guaranteed income movement makes change, that artists will also benefit from that. As I mentioned, here are some of the categories and communities I mentioned. So our program really is supporting Black, Indigenous folks of color. The queer community is very well represented, as well as the deaf and disabled artist community. We're interested in caregiving, and also because the movement is interested in caregiving as an interesting parallel of labor that's not often supported or valued, celebrated financially, as a similar parallel to how artists are not supported. When we talk about artists, culture bearers, culture makers, we're happy to share how we came to that definition. We have some information on our website about that, but mostly just wanted to give you all a sense of when we say artists, we mean all kinds of artists. And that is really true. I wish that I could share more about the conversations we've been having with all of these thousands of folks over the last couple of years who don't even neatly fit into these categories. It's quite incredible and fascinating. As we mentioned, we have artists in 60 of our 62 counties in New York State. This image of the map may look like there's lots of pockets where artists aren't, but those are places where people literally can't live. So just wanted to point that out. Kind of similar to the overall population of New York State, we have just over 60% of our artists are based in the city, and the rest remaining in other parts of the state. What else? Yes, so just a little bit more, really fascinating. I hope what you see in these numbers is a really incredible opportunity to make sense of who artists are, what their livelihoods are, where they live, how they think about money, how they think about their family life, their community life. There's all sorts of ways that we hope our research will encourage all of us to think about differently about who artists are, right? Because I think this initial data really points in that direction. I'm going to pass to you, Jamie, to talk a little bit more about the research.
Thank you, Maura. And I just want to echo, it feels a little awkward to be presenting on some of the impact evaluation findings from this program, since Doug and Joanna are the ones leading that research. So I'm going to do a little bit of a 30,000 foot view first. and then get about our sort of overall approach to research and the different kinds of research initiatives we've been doing related to guaranteed income, and then we'll dive into some of the initial findings. So you can go to the next slide, Maura. Thank you. So just outlined here, just want to sort of name, Creatives Rebuild New York didn't exist when we were launched, right? It was a new program. Maura talked about sort of the origins and the think tank of designing the programs, but we also had to understand what we were going to be able to do in the 3 years that we had to sort of both evaluate the impact of our program, but also recognize the sort of, I don't want to say historic, that sounds a little bit overly ambitious, but just to say, like, this was a big experiment. And so we needed to make sure that we were also sort of gathering data about the artists in New York, since we had the capacity to do so, understanding what really happened in our work and the process, the idea of a process evaluation, and documenting what we did and how we implemented our programs, what went well, what didn't go well. We also felt an obligation to sort of be communicating with the rest of the field, others who were doing guaranteed income. As Maura said, there's a huge movement about guaranteed income, period, but also working with others who were doing guaranteed income for artists programs. So that's folks like Yerba Buena Center in San Francisco, Springboard for the Arts, Ireland, a group called Black Music Action Coalition in Nashville. So we had a working group that brought folks together to learn together and to make some field level recommendations about what we were learning. And then last but not least, impact evaluations, the sort of more traditional, what actually happened, how did our programs impact artists' lives and livelihoods. And I'll just note here, because Maura mentioned at the top, we do have a whole other artist employment program. We did all of these things for that program too, right? So we had a series of working groups, a series of process evaluations, a series of impact evaluations happening. Next slide, Maura. And so just naming that, so Maura mentioned the 22,000 applicants to the guaranteed income program, which obviously shows immense need across the state. But it also gave us a lot of data, right, from the applicants themselves who applied to the programs. But in addition to that, we found during our think tank process, and as many people know, I think especially those in the research world, that federal census data, American Community Survey data, BLS data is lacking about artists, right? It doesn't capture the reality of how artists show up in the workforce, or the full picture of who artists are, how many there are in New York State. That was a big gap that in our think tank we identified. How do we know who to support? Where are they? So in addition to our applications, when we launched them, we launched a survey called the Portrait of New York State Artists Survey. And so what you see here we had over 13,000 responses. So it was an optional set of questions when folks applied that they could answer additional questions in these areas that you see here. And we were really, really thrilled about that response rate, and have been using this data in a lot of ways. So in addition to there's a whole other set of reasons why we did the survey, but in addition to the application questions, it provided a great baseline for the impact evaluations. I'm also mentioning it here and in the next slide because it's another partnership that we have with Indiana, with Doug and Joanna, validating this data against federal data and understanding how there are differences between who's showing up in our data set as artists and what we otherwise know about artists. Next slide, Maura. And just a quick mention, I'd be foolish not to plug it, that this data set and the survey is publicly available at NADAC, at the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture, thanks to some support from the NEA. And so we're really keen on having others use that data and have it live on beyond our sunset. Next slide, Maura. So, a lot of the work that Maura talked about, I just want to sort of name explicitly that we do have a process evaluation about our guaranteed income program. And actually this slide is a little bit of a mess, a mix up of two slides, but we have a process evaluation. We'll drop that into the chat where it gets into the nitty gritty, as I mentioned, of the details of the immense scale that Maura and her team grappled with in terms of validation of folks' eligibility and what it means to actually support not just 22,000 applicants, but 2,400 artists in a program. I'll go straight to the next slide. And then, as mentioned, we held these working groups of other folks in the guaranteed income community. And again, I think, before we dive into the impact evaluation, I do want to spend a tiny bit of time on the things that came out of this group of people who are, these were program administrators, some other researchers, and really sort of advancing some of the ideas that are important that come out of what it means to support artists with a guaranteed income. So you can see here the 5 recommendations that we made. And again, some of the they range from big picture public perception issues around work and deservingness, which artists are an incredible population that can help both push on those narratives, but also sort of they embody that, they live that, and live or push against it in the ways that they choose to live and work. Building a base of artists who support guaranteed income is an important sort of step and work that Maura and her team has taken on, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That is an important way to have continue to connect the arts and culture sector to the guaranteed income world. Really focusing on public policy at the state level. That's something that, again, Maura will talk about a little bit later. Really understanding where the movement is, the overall guaranteed movement is, and understanding that there are different populations that we don't know. Actually, there is not a lot of data, for example, on rural and indigenous populations receiving guaranteed income. There's not a lot of, there's a lot of questions about sort of duration and time that people need to receive guaranteed income for it to have lasting impacts, as opposed to short-term impacts on their lives. There's a lot sort of going on in the movement that if you're going to do a new guaranteed income program, it makes sense to align and sort of fill some of those gaps, both in the research sense, but also in terms of the populations that need to be served. And then last but not least, we have sort of an implicit mandate to push on the philanthropic field and the arts sector and arts funders to think about ways that guaranteed income as a philosophy and as a way of funding artists is worthy, even if you don't call it guaranteed income. How do you think beyond merit-based investments in artists? How do you think about sort of regular distribution of cash rather than big lump sum payments of grants, things like that? And so there's a lot more on each of these topics in our working group recommendation document. We'll drop links to all of these things at the end of this presentation. Next slide, Maura. Okay, finally, so the impact evaluations. And so the first thing I wanted to note is that both in our artist employment program and in the guaranteed income program, I think we needed to acknowledge, and one way that I tend to approach research is there's a lot of different folks that care about this program. Some of them come from an arts and culture background and are thinking about artists and their lives and their practice. Others are coming from an economic policy, economic justice, labor policy sort of background. So it's really important to bring all those expertises and knowledge, forms of knowledge to bear on the evaluations that we're doing. So we very intentionally invested in 2 different evaluations, which is actually merged into one through deep collaboration. But just naming here, these are the folks, these are the institutions that are leading, what we started out as sort of 2 different evaluations. So one really looking at cultural policy. Obviously, Joanna and Doug are economists and social scientists. Everybody brings sort of multiple, I would say, types of scholarship to their own work. But for us, there was like folks that could really speak to the audience of cultural policy, and the folks that could really speak to the audience of economic policy. And so you'll see that the other team, Appalachian State University, NYU Cash Transfer Lab, WashU, and CUNY, that's a collaboration amongst those institutions on an evaluation, and they are folks that are leading many other guaranteed income evaluations across the country in different capacities. And so just to name that, it has been a total joy to work across, and maybe Joanna and Doug can speak to this later, maybe more complicated for them, but to learn from each other and to have sort of regular meetings across these teams to talk about what we're finding and to understand where there are overlaps. Next slide, Mark. I'll note, so one of the decisions we made early on when we're dealing with the scale of our program, again, 2,400 artists, 22,000 applicants, was to sort of just make the decision to collaborate on one survey, right? Going back to this many people multiple times with multiple different sets of questions was just going to kill participation. And so one of the first steps that happened was this decision to collaborate on the survey. And so maybe stating the obvious, we do not have an RCT. We did not sort of set it up as a control group. But we did have the ability to go back to the original sets of applicants. So we actually have a really robust set of data on both the GI participants and non-participants. And you'll see here that in addition to the initial application data and baseline survey, which I mentioned earlier, the teams decided to do an 18-month survey. So at the end of the final payment after 18 months, and then another one at 21 months later. 3 months later after the end of the program. So 21 months from the start. Maura didn't mention this, but the way that payments happened for those 24,000 was in waves, right? So we had some folks that started receiving money in March, some that started or November, then December, then October. So there were different sort of almost classes. So an immense effort to conduct this survey. The Center for Survey Research in Indiana has done an incredible job of keeping this all in order. In addition to the survey and the quantitative data that was collected, both teams did a series of qualitative interviews with participants. And then we also did something through the Appalachian State team, creative expression submissions. So we invited artists and paid artists to submit sort of a creative expression. So that could be anything from a poem or a song or a recording of them dancing or a painting that expressed their experience of participating in the guaranteed income program or of receiving guaranteed income. And that has created some incredible qualitative data and beautiful and profoundly moving results to that part of the work. Next slide, Maura. Here you can just see, sort of building off of what I shared in the Portrait of New York State Artists survey, the questions for the evaluation were in these following categories. So looking at everything from artistic practice and time spent on work and income on arts and non-arts work, looking at things like financial circumstances, details of financial circumstances, physical and mental well-being, geographic information, demographic information. I'll also note that in addition to the application and survey data that's described here, we have banking data and credit information from artists who consented to share those materials with the research team. And that's because of the nature of the payments and how we distributed cash through a partner called Steady. And so we were able to do that, and that's the expertise, for example, of the WashU team. Last thing I want to say about this before we dive into some of the findings is the response rates were out of this world. We had a nearly 55% response rate among participants. That's over 1,315 of the 2,400 were engaged in the survey. And then the control group was a 20% response rate, but that's over 4,000 artists. So just to say the scale of the data that we have from this program is pretty exciting, and it's something that I know Doug and Joanna are keen to continue researching into the future, even once Creatives Rebuild moves on. Next slide. So let's see, a couple months ago, we released a document with preliminary findings from the program. So the surveys were just closing over the course of this summer. Again, we're trying to squeeze program design, implementation, and evaluation into 3 years of an 18-month program. And so we figured it was exciting and important to get initial findings out there while we had the capacity to promote that. And so you can see here that the high level findings were that artists who receive guaranteed income prioritize debt and savings payments. They pay their bills. That's utilities, rent, things like that. They were able to choose work that works for them. So starting to shift some of their practice from non-arts work to arts-based practice, more time on their practice. That's a huge theme in everything that we've heard and been seeing. There were dramatic improvements in well-being, particularly around mental health. And we also heard both qualitatively and some of the initial data shows that people had more time and space for caregiving, or were able to show up in different ways in their caregiving responsibilities. I'm going to just move straight to the next one so we make sure there's lots of time for questions. We are going to be releasing, so again, the collaboration across Indiana's team with the others, we've decided to release the final findings as a series of briefs covering different topics. And so you can see here what those are going to be, what the what the different categories are. And so they'll hopefully be digestible, 3 to 4 pages. They'll have the sort of quantitative data alongside quotes, alongside the creative submissions, really to paint a picture on some of these topic areas. Again, this is my research nerd hat. This is because some people care a lot about labor and they don't care about health and well-being. Other people care about health and well-being, not about sort of community impacts. So really allowing people in the guaranteed income community and folks who care about artists and arts and culture to sort of choose what kinds of impacts of guaranteed income they are interested in finding out. These will obviously be presented as a series. So you can look at all of them if you're interested. So you already heard a little bit about the demographics earlier from Maura. There's going to be a lot more to that in the report or in the brief, but just a quick top level preview, sneak preview for this group of the sort of findings in the area of labor. Essentially, it's positive, right? Because financial pressure is relieved, artists are able to spend more time on their craft, explore new creative avenues, and plan for a more sustainable future in their arts career. And so that's overall sort of a general finding that we're happy to be able to report. In time, so directly related, and maybe these briefs will be combined. Again, you are truly seeing in process work. The idea that time, people, the relationship between money and time is on one hand perhaps obvious, but on the other hand, like needs to be stated, right? When you have time, you can make choices about, or when you have money, you can make choices about how you spend your time. So in some cases, there's people spending less time on a certain kind of work, but that might allow them more time with their family for caregiving, more time on their creative practice, et cetera. So again, I think this is one area where we think artists are a unique and interesting population to study within guaranteed income in terms of the shift in time spent. Next one, Mara. So as I mentioned, we have access to credit data and bank account data for spending patterns. So that's where we have the information about what artists spent their payments on. And so again, artists are not unlike other folks who receive guaranteed income in this way. Humans need to pay their bills, and we're in an economy that's difficult for many, many people, especially low-income people. And so paying off debts, buying essential items like food, investing in their families, this is the kind of thing that shows up in the data, that's spending data. Financial well-being. So again, this is where we talk about sort of that, what I shared in the preliminary findings, sort of paying down debt and investing in savings, and having emergency savings is something that bore out in the survey data when we really look at sort of overall both perception of how one is financially stable and the reality. Next one. I think this is second to last. Health and well-being. Essentially, we have dramatic numbers, as I mentioned, about mental health, but overall things like agency, self-esteem, some of the questions in the survey really dive deep into this, and overwhelmingly, again, people are people. There are nuances and exceptions to every single one of these findings, but overall, the health and well-being improves, and that tracks with most of the canon of research around guaranteed income. Next one. The last brief around community and broader impacts. We do have an interest in understanding how, again, when you have money and then you have time, how does that shift how you show up in your community? Have time for not just your family, but other community-based work. So I think that's one of the topics that we explore in this final brief. And I'm going to end this sort of blitz of findings just with one testimony. These are the kinds of quotes that we heard in the qualitative interviews that Maura and her team have been hearing through gatherings that they've held throughout the program, and regular calls that they have with artists in the program. And just to say that, and some of the images that are coming in through the creative submissions method, our biggest takeaway from all of this is that financial security supports artists as whole human beings, and clears the path for them to have more time for their creative work. And so I think this is one of a million testimonies that we have. Now I'm being hyperbolic, like the quote, but it's many, many testimonies that we have that really just drive home how important it is to support folks with direct cash. Maura, I'm going to pass it back to you.
I think it might be 1 million. I don't know.
It
The
might be
way
1 million.
it's set up, it feels like I've gotten at least that over this year, if not the last couple. Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I just wanted to emphasize here too, like for us from the as the administrators and stewards of this Creators Rebuild New York, experiment, seeing that these are the findings coming out is really affirming, because it shows at a minimum that artists are very much like all of the other people who have been served by a guaranteed income pilot or program over the last couple of years, which just allows us to grow solidarity and grow the movement, and also support artists better and potentially differently than how we as a field have been thinking about supporting individual artists in the past. The fact that artists are spending money on bills suggests that they perhaps weren't able to do so prior to, right, considering the arts and culture ecosystem that we currently live within. So we're really excited about all of these findings. We just wanted to leave you with a couple of more pieces, things to chew on, to consider, and about related to the work that we're doing. So all of this, implementing the program, evaluating the program, stewarding the work, has also led us to understand how we can seed it in the future, knowing that Creators Rebuild New York will close its operations fairly soon. So earlier you heard Jamie talk about a working group, because we believe in participatory process and collaborative knowledge building, right? We gathered people who had been working on guaranteed income for artists, guaranteed income, looking at that intersection. And there were these recommendations that came forth. We were, in the time that we had left, able to take on a couple of those, a version of those recommendations in our own work, and just wanted to share a pocket of those, because the data also informs how these have life and have legs into the future. So one of those recommendations, for example, was challenge harmful narratives around work and deservingness. One way we took that on was to really strategically put stories in popular media channels about artists in our guaranteed income program. Really proud and excited for our artists, right, who are able to share their stories on their terms with news outlets such as Business Insider, Next City, Ms. Magazine. More recently, we had work on Nonprofit Quarterly, their stuff in Brooklyn Reader around the arts employment program. We see that this as one version. There's lots of ways narrative change can take shape, but this is one version of how you start to unpack who is deserving, right, of cash through storytelling, and with not just our arts folks, but all kinds of readership. Another recommendation from that working group was to build a base of artists who can champion a guaranteed income. And so a major project of ours has been this artist power building school, which does a few things, is wrapping up in a few weeks, but nurtures the leadership and the cultural organizing of a cohort of fellows within the program. We have 23 fellows, artist fellows, who received guaranteed income. We hoped might be radicalized by the experience and hope to champion more. We have a series, we developed some curriculum, a series of political education style workshops and more for all of the artists in our programs, which we share with other pilots and friends. And then we also put out grants to some of our homies who are thinking about solidarity economics, right, and the arts, to spread that curriculum to their communities of artists and other places. So thinking about the Waymakers Collective, Springboard for the Arts, Indie Space here in New York, et cetera, received some funds in order to spread the good word, so to speak. And then the final that I'll share here, although there's other work that we've been doing and has been happening, relates to the recommendation from that working group to focus on public policy wins, right? We really see, and the movement sees, that the future of guaranteed income rests in strategic policies for all. One thing we were proud to launch now almost a year ago is the New York State Cash Alliance, which is what it sounds like. It's a cash coalition, so to speak. We're not the only cash coalition. They're popping up in states, really seeing state as the important scale and leverage point towards larger national federal guaranteed income. Of course, post-election, I actually see, and I think a lot of people doing this work see this as more important than ever, particularly as benefits protections, et cetera, might be getting slashed. We need to have a really strong, powerful base and strong organizing core to make sure that at the bare minimum, right, the existing sort of framework for cash policy can exist, so that we can have bigger wins into the future. Lots of things going on. Thank you all for your time and listening to a little bit of our work, and we're excited to be in conversation with you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great.
I have not seen the chat.
I'll take care of the chat. Don't worry about that one. Thank you so much, Maura and Jamie. Even though I know so much about this project, I feel like I learn something every time I hear you present. So thank you. So there's a great question in the chat from Sean, and I know this is something that came up in our discussions, maybe very early on when we were designing the survey, but it's about how much do we know about the relationship between guaranteed income and project funding for artists? So in other words, do we know anything about how these artists use the payments to help fund their work? And he provides the example of, we see here in Chicago that most use unrestricted grant funding to pay their dancers and production costs at the expense of paying themselves. How much do we know about this, which with regard to how the artists in the program use their payments?
Oh, I love that. We're starting to know. I mean, you could probably answer this better than I could, Joanna, but I think Jamie and I always had a hunch early that like artists were paying other artists with these funds. And I think that's starting to show up in the data as well. Certainly anecdotally, we know that, and this comes into the findings around all of them in a way, labor and time, but so many artists have been able to take risk in their work in a way that perhaps because the work wasn't as strictly tied to needing to make money off the work or was less tied to an institution, for example. So more artists were able to take more risk, which sometimes meant investing in new material, investing in other people, investing in different venue. So I think that is showing up, but Joanna can correct me.
Well, I think I mean, I'm curious to hear about your experiences, because we didn't ask a question about that on the survey, and it was something that were interested in, but obviously the survey is long and we have to be able to narrow down so that we don't take up everybody's time. But I think we weren't able to see in the spending data exactly sometimes where the money went. So I'm wondering, maybe through your conversations, through some anecdotal evidence, whether or not you heard that to be the case.
I was just going to jump in and say that, Joanna, just to say that in this, unfortunately, it's not going to show up the way we would like it to show up in the spending data because of the range of ways that artistic expenses show up in categories of spending data, right? So unless you buy it at an art store, or what it means to rent studio space versus other kind of rent, that sort of thing, it's not. So it won't show up in the spending data brief, but I do know that the Appalachian State and CUNY teams in their interview process did get a lot of testimony and anecdotal evidence. And there's a ton of quotes about sort of being able to spend money on artistic materials. And again, often it translates into time to spend, onto artistic practice. But to your point, to the question about comparing to project funding, we don't have that comparison, right, within this program. In our artist employment program is a whole other beast. So we don't have a sort of a perfect comparison, but yes, we do know that we've had conversations, I would say, with others who are thinking about guaranteed income, who are thinking of investing in guaranteed income like ways. How can you? I think this was a conversation actually this year at Grant Makers in the Arts. How can you sort of require, maybe you can't give direct cash, but you can give an unrestricted grant, but then you can require that artists pay themselves first within that. Don't know what that means. You don't have to set what that is, but that's definitely a conversation that's happening broadly. And, I don't know that it's going to bear out in the quantitative data that we have, but yes, it'll show up in the qualitative.
Right. And there's a question from Attila that I might just paraphrase a little bit and maybe even change. Sorry, Attila, but there's some kind of questions in here that I think Jamie and Maura would be particularly good at answering. And it's about the future horizon of the work that you've done. And, obviously CRNY is sunsetting at the end of December. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a little bit of state initiative, so New York State initiative in getting these programs started. Is that correct? I believe there was a meeting at least sort of early on before CRNY was developed. And so I guess I'm looking at the future horizon, whether or not you know, and whether or not CRNY has been involved in, or maybe even thought about the potential of a program like this to be implemented at a state or government level. Because right now we're talking about private philanthropy and things can work all different ways, but I don't know, where have your conversations gone in that direction or at all?
Maura, you start and I'll dig up some links.
Awesome. Yeah, in our rush to make sure we got through all the content, neglected to mention part of the genesis story of Creators Rebuild New York was that as we were presented with the global pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, then Governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo, put together a table of folks to build, to consider how to essentially revitalize the economy of New York State. It was called the Rebuild New York Commission. There's a whole report on it that was looking at the different economic sectors of New York State. The arts table, so to speak, included Elizabeth Alexander, the president of the Mellon Foundation, and came up with the very beginning bare bones of what Creatives Rebuild New York would eventually become. As you can gather, the state did not fund that. And in lieu of that, funders, I think, listened well to what the arts field and what artists needed and put their money together to start to initiate this organization. So there was some version of a public-private funding conversation at play at the beginning, but ultimately landed in exclusively the private funding realm. What I would say is that, from my point of view, at least, I think the future of guaranteed income in a US context, although the US is not the only context, and there's very interesting, compelling basic income work happening globally. But I think I see artists being most supported when and if artists are included in the policy consideration for all. So rather than trying to win on an exclusively artist-focused, right, policy, we win when we win for guaranteed income for all working people. And then kind of to the example you were offering earlier, Jamie, about unrestricted cash grant, but pay your artist first, for example, there's lots of little nuances to how we can, and I'd say there's an interesting blueprint, I'll try to find that too, put out by the Economic Security Project, who's a real anchor in the basic income and guaranteed basic income field. And this blueprint lays out, like, how do we win over 20 years? Like, what are the stages? And includes things like make more of our cash policies more guaranteed income like, right? Remove restrictions, move money more directly to people. So I also see that as a important and major win. I think maybe, Attila, you're also wondering about, like, how do we make the case fundraising wise for this? And you'll have to tell me, because I mean, I I have my ideas, but I don't know if they always work, because the climate is always shifting, and how philanthropy meets the need of the moment.
Thank you. Neil, you've had your hand up for a little while.
That's fine. Thank you for recognizing me, and thank you to the presentation. I think it was actually very, very great and a great project. But as probably the oldest person in this group here, and one who's been researching the economics of artists for, I just checked my first book on this, or report on this, for the National Endowment for the, for the New England Foundation for the Arts 41 years ago. A question that over my career of doing this, of course, is when you do your own survey, is how representative do you really think it is of the population of artists that you were trying to get at in New York State? By the way, I grew up in New York State, so I have a little bit of a knowledge, suburban New York City. When we did this study 41 years ago of the 6 states in New England, one of the key questions was outreach. How did you, because we did a survey, which we hoped drew in a representative sample of the population of artists. how did you do that? What was your outreach to get the applicants, the 22,000 people you've talked about, to get them to apply? Because they're not just going to drop in, they need to get information about it. And how do you get those people, how they compare to the actual population? It's really crucial in understanding the validity of the results that you have.
So glad you asked that question, Neil. Just want to make sure, how do they compare to the population of New York, or how do they compare to the population of artists?
Well, either or both is relevant.
Yeah.
I mean,
So,
because if you're only trying to generalize for the state of New York, which is a unique state when you've got such a big dominant city, and then
Right.
you have basically the rest of the city and metropolitan area, and then you have the rest of the state. Not all the states are like that. So, maybe you need to address that for both. How does it compare for the state, and how does it compare to the nation?
yeah. So, a couple different answers to your question. One is we set out, in terms of the values that we had as an organization, the eligibility that Maura talked about, sort of who we were trying to serve with this program. We hired 10 artists, artist organizers, and hired an outreach corps at the beginning of our application process. And they were from different regions of the state and representative of different communities, the deaf and disabled community, the indigenous communities. And we actually hired those artists as organizers, trusted messengers, to get the word out in their communities and in communities across the state. It was really important to us to, we did other forms of outreach through local arts councils and things like that, but sort of we wanted to acknowledge that not everyone, not all artists, particular culture bearers, folks that don't call themselves artists with a capital A, they're not the ones that are fluent in the grant making and philanthropic funding systems. They don't always have access to this kind of thing. So that was a really important part of our program design, was to have this outreach core and to get the word out there. We talk about sort of reaching not the usual suspects. And so that's the outreach portion of your question. I think what you're getting at also leads to why we did the Portrait of New York State Artists survey. Again, in the think tank, in our conversations about designing this program and for whom, we can use survey data from the census. We can use federal data, but it's not, I mean, Joanne and Doug, I'll kick this to you, who did some of the validation about our data versus what's available in federal data set. There isn't good data on who the artists are in New York State or in New York City, right? Even the city, New York City, one of the biggest city in the US and one of the biggest art cities in the world, right? It doesn't have a full graph. We've been working locally with the DCLA and others about sort of exactly who and how many are the artists that are here. And so the premise of your question is 100% valid, but I don't know that there's even a standard for us to start with, right? So we needed to create a definition of who are artists in New York State through our survey, and then within our evaluation, we're comparing applicants to participants, right? So just to be very clear, we're not actually comparing it to a ton of other artists. We do know that there is a slice of artists that we are serving through this program because of our eligibility. And that's who we're talking about. But Joanne and Doug, I would love for you to add to that.
Doug, do you want to talk? I don't want to talk the whole time.
I know we're short on time. I would just say it's a great question. I think it's one of the great opportunities we have for such a large data set of these artists and being able to compare, because it's not artists as defined by primary occupation or all the limitations we normally get from the big federal data set. So I think it's an interesting opportunity. And there's obviously targeting in the very beginning and eligibility requirements. So it's not going to generalize, and it shouldn't generalize to all artists in New York State or all New Yorkers for both reasons. But it's an interesting, and it's a huge group to get 20,000 or even 6,000 respondents on this is amazing.
Yeah. Michael.
Okay, thanks very much for the presentation. I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate here. So we're looking at this program that's going to be for artists. And, as you pointed out, artists face many financial challenges similar to other precarious working people. I do like to flip that back, and because it does raise the question of what makes artists special. Why would you do a program of guaranteed income for artists and not for everybody, and we might advocate it for everybody, but it does open up an entirely different thing. To get to my question, though, normally when we have any kind of public funding project in any realm, whether it be art and culture or public health or transportation, the way we evaluate outcomes is in terms of the sort of public good that arises from it. And so in most arts policy evaluation, the main thing you look at is, well, what were the arts things that came out of this that improved quality of life for the general public? We don't typically look and say, did this improve the standing of artists as such? Because public policies are not designed to benefit the people who work in them. They're designed for the public good. We don't evaluate programs in the Department of Transportation according to whether people who work in the road construction business like the policy, right? You know, we look to see, well, are these good roads and practical bridges and things that are being built? And on this program here, the whole evaluation so far seems to be, did it make artists happy? And in fact, right at the beginning of the presentation, you said this is a program by artists for artists. But I'm gonna just put out there that that's kind of a questionable way to do policy analysis, because normally you wouldn't say arts policy is for artists. You'd say it's for the public good, just as you would in any other policy realm. And I worry about this evaluation that it is so focused on, well, did artists like it? If you had asked me to predict, would a randomly selected group of artists who get a guaranteed income for 18 months, did they like it? I'm going to predict, yeah. We're going to say, yes, of course they are. Any of us would. It doesn't really get us very far. So program evaluation has to look beyond that. This is no strings attached, so we're not looking at the art produced, but honestly, at the end of the day, that is really where you have to look to see if this was successful or not. Because if it didn't result in actual arts outcomes, works that people can enjoy, then you have to ask, you know, all we've done is have a transfer program to people who define themselves as artists, not other precarious poor people, but just this one specified group. We give them money, they like it. I'm just not sure how far that gets us. So is there a way that we can look beyond just this survey to the way we would actually ordinarily evaluate a public program, especially if this were going to be expanded?
So many ways to answer your question. Thank you for that. And I appreciate the devil's advocate. I think there's, first of all, we're not asking if they like it, right? We're looking at health and well-being outcomes. We're looking at mental health. We're looking at financial stability. We're looking at income levels. We're looking at spending data. We are looking at hard data. And I would push back on your premise of policy only be, you know, labor policy, jobs, workforce development policy is actually about quality jobs, right? And I think artists as a class of workers in our society need to be investigated far more than they have in the history of arts and culture research, right? There is no creative economy. There is no creative production without creative workers. Creative workers can't be creative workers unless they are meeting their basic needs, right? So looking at sort of how arts and culture production happens in this country doesn't happen unless we look at the individual artist. So that's the premise as an organization that we are set up. And I will remind you that we are philanthropically funded and we have an artist employment program that's a totally different intervention, right? Jobs, salaries with benefits, whole other set of research. We'll link to a document for you that you can look at those. But I think, you know, to the question about whether artists are unicorns or special, exceptional in any way, we would argue within this guaranteed income program that they are not, right? They are a class of workers and they are representative of the future of work in many ways. Work is turning into gig work. More people have part-time jobs. And they're assembling different kinds of jobs together. The model of a 9-to-5 job with benefits is going away for many, many people, and artists are in some ways, origin of that, right? So they're a really important population to study in this regard and to understand how something like guaranteed income affects them and the way that they can spend their time, make their livings. I think connecting up, and maybe Maura, I'll shush and let you add anything you want to add, but connecting to the guaranteed income policy and economic justice policy sort of movement that's happening, I'll remind everyone that most of the dollars that were spent on guaranteed income over the last 4 years were public dollars, right? They came from Recovery Act funds through cities, right? So these were investments that were directly related to poverty alleviation. And that's public policy, right? Child tax credits are public policy. I dropped in earlier a set of resources. Maura mentioned the New York State Cash Alliance. So a bunch of other folks that are advocating for cash policy, not artists, that we've joined with, because we believe if there are economic and workforce and financial safety net policies that are for everyone, artists will benefit, right? We believe that. We believe that artists are not exceptional. They are deserving like everyone else. We've also endeavored to make recommendations to city and state policymakers around ways that actual artists, the creative workforce, can be better supported through non-arts policies, not just cultural policy. So I'm jumping around, but you hit on a lot of different topics that we're certainly immersed in and thinking a lot about in this program. And there are tensions, right? There are tensions between our two programs. But I would reject that we have to show the public good or the results of the art making to make the case that artists are deserving as a population in this country of workers.
Yeah,
Maura?
thanks, Jamie. I don't have a ton more to add. Just in everything you laid out is very much what's top of mind for me, and I would encourage you, Michael, and other folks who are interested and have deep experience in developing policy to just take a gander at the really impressive canon of research coming out of the basic income and guaranteed income space from the Stanford Basic Income Lab, Center for Guaranteed Income Research at UPenn. There's all sorts of, and this is not new, although it's the rise of the movement has certainly been, there's been a lot of momentum in the last 7 years or so, but over a few decades there's many things to point to, and really what a guaranteed income is policy is making sense of is a social contract, right? And what is it that we really owe to each other as we share this planet, right? As we are citizens of this nation, and are we comfortable with people being and not having enough, considering the wealth of this place? So we see, and I think some of our work, to Jamie's point around the unicorn, is to say artists are a part of that story too. And it would impart us to ensure that they're considered when we're thinking about safety net policies, et cetera. But yeah.
Thank you, Jamie and Maura. We have to end now, but I would love to not have to end. But I wanted to say thank you so much for not only the presentation, but also for taking on these tough questions. And this is obviously a larger conversation, a tough conversation to have, lots of different elements to consider. So I appreciate you just really thoughtfully thinking about people's questions and addressing them, especially given all of your experience. So thank you. And with that, oh, well, I wanted to also just give you an opportunity to say goodbye to everybody, because I always cut everybody off. So thank you. And then I wanted to just say thank you to all of our audience attendees. It's been a really wonderful past few months, and I hope to see you again in February. So with that, I'll end the series for the next couple months, and we'll be in touch, everyone. So thanks.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.